Sisyphus is not for sissies. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. That is the first sentence of Albert Camus' 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. The essay which introduced the concept of the absurd and was a milestone in the broader movement called existentialism. I was reminded of this whole body of thought in January when I invited you to bring in the words you live by, and Jean Pickett brought in the passage about Sisyphus by Richard Kellaway, which I read a moment ago. I remarked at the time that it was both appropriate and ironic that the one among us who labored at the helm of the Unitarian Universalist Association should choose a piece about Sisyphus. But it also made me want to revisit the whole subject. Albert Camus wrote in the 1940s and 50s and died in 1960. But it took a while for his ideas to percolate down to the American provinces. And so he was just the age when I was first coming of age in the early 1960s. I remember reading him in high school, but I particularly remember him from church. He was widely read and discussed by the ministers and lay people that I listened to in the early 1960s. Have you ever been walking down the street and been struck with the idea that you just don't understand life? Maybe you get the little tasks, and maybe you get through the day and navigate your way around career and work and family life and community life all right, but you can't see how it all fits into the bigger picture. Or maybe you've had a serious breakdown in one area. Your marriage came to an end. Or you switch careers. Or you retire. Or you get hit with a major accident or illness, and you have to reinvent yourself. All of these are crises of meaning. And there's a fundamental problem, and it is this. Our minds are designed to look for meaning, to try to find meaning, to try to make sense of things. And sometimes things resist being made sense of. Sometimes for all our attempts to understand, for all our wisdom and training and experience, we don't get it. It just doesn't add up. It might be a small way something doesn't make sense. A friend drops a casual remark and it stays with you for days because you can't understand what they meant. Or it might be that day after day you are encountering people behaving in ways that you can't account for. Or it might be that the whole world except you seems to have gone crazy. Or maybe you suspect that you are truly the crazy one. Welcome to the absurd. We often think of the word absurd in connection with humor. And laughter is often our response to a perception of discontinuities in meaning. But there's precious little funny about the absurd, as Camus describes it. It is an aspect of the human tragedy. Camus introduced the concept and explored it in his Sisyphus essay, starting with the idea of suicide. Why is it that some people conclude that they should take their own lives? Here's his quote. What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without memory, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life is properly the feeling of absurdity, unquote. Man feels an alien, a stranger. Of course, this is period language, we would today say humans or a person. At about the same time that he wrote this essay, Camus was writing his best-known novel, The Stranger. And Camus himself was an Algerian, born of European parents who had emigrated to France. At the time of his essay, France had been overrun by the Nazis, and Camus himself was deeply involved in the resistance. It was a topsy-turvy world in which he found himself. Suicide is one response, says Camus, to a feeling of absurdity. Now he's quick to add that those who find no meaning in life often do not commit suicide, and those who do commit suicide may do so for reasons completely unrelated to a crisis of meaning. But by pairing absurdity and suicide, Camus is really asking two questions. First, is a life devoid of meaning worth living? And second, how can we live our lives when our structures of meaning collapse? Camus was not the first thinker to notice that the structures of meaning which had sustained the Western world had collapsed. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, almost a century before, had outlined a philosophy called existentialism, which depended heavily on the absurd. Here's how Kierkegaard defined it. What is the absurd? It is, as may quite easily be seen, that I, a rational being, must act in a case where my reason, my powers of reflection, tell me you can just as well do the one thing as the other. That is to say, where my reason and reflection say, you cannot act, and yet here is where I have to act. The absurd, or to act by virtue of the absurd, is to act upon faith. I must act, but reflection has closed the road, so I take one of the possibilities and say, this is what I do. I cannot do otherwise because I am brought to a standstill by my powers of reflection. That's Kierkegaard, end quote. You can just as well do the one thing as the other, but you have to act. I remember reading in college, it might have been in Kierkegaard, about a man sitting in a train station realizing that it made just as much sense to take the northbound train as to take the southbound train, just as much sense to take the westbound train as the eastbound train, so he sat in the train station all night. In my endeavors to bring the latest in truth to you, I've gone so far as to consult Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia entry on the absurd brings a lot of clarity to this whole subject. It suggests that when you put Kierkegaard and Camus together, you come up with three responses to the absurdity of existence, which arises out of, again, the fundamental disharmony between the individual search for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. The first is, you can commit suicide, which both Kierkegaard and Camus reject. Camus saying that it just adds one absurdity to another. Second, you can embrace a religious, spiritual, or abstract belief in a transcendent realm, being, or idea, which Kierkegaard recommended, but Camus rejected. This source of meaning, which some will call God, is outside the world and is reachable only through what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. Or, the third response, you can accept the absurd and continue to live in spite of it, which was Camus' solution. And he used Sisyphus as his striking image of this solution in the last section of his famous essay.